My name is Spencer, and this is part 4 of our series, How to Get Started in Spiritual Disciplines, or maybe for some of us, How to Get Restarted, because this is something we need to reignite in our life. So far, as we've been going through this series, we've been talking about some big ideas around spiritual disciplines. We talked about setting our expectations. That was session 1. We talked about finding our distractions and seeing our distractions. That was session 2. Session 3 was about identifying what it is that we're aiming for, so we have a clear idea. Now, in this session, we're going to really drill down on what are spiritual disciplines. Now, I'm using that term spiritual disciplines. There's other terms to use. Some people might talk not about spiritual disciplines, but maybe spiritual practices. And these are folks who generally don't like the word discipline, but I tend to like this word discipline because a disciple is someone who disciplines themselves. And so a spiritual discipline is not like a punishment like discipline, but rather a way of shaping your life like we practice with different disciplines that we might have in our life. And so I use this term spiritual discipline because I think it's the most common term that people use, but certainly there's other spiritual practices. Sometimes you'll hear people talk about spiritual formation. We use that term in our church from time to time. I love that term. I just don't think it's that widely known, but I love the idea of spiritual formation because one of the things that it highlights is that we are always being formed. Always being formed. Whether we're being formed spiritually or whether we're being formed by the world. You know, every time you watch the news, you're being formed. Every time you watch commercials, you're being formed towards consumerism. There's all kinds of ways that we're always being formed. And one of the ways we need to be formed is spiritually so that we can reflect Jesus as his disciples. And so I love this idea. I also love the idea of spiritual formation because it sounds like that we are always a work in progress, whether we're just starting out or whether we've been at this for a long, long time. I think about it like a lump of clay that's being shaped into a pot, whether you're just starting out as a lump of clay or whether you're being glazed and the work is almost over, like all along the line, you are being shaped and formed. And I think this is a really helpful way of thinking about these practices. Some people will talk about a very old term, but they'll talk about these in terms of means of grace, which again, I really like that term. However, it's not very common and it's an old way of talking about this. And means of grace are helpful because what they highlight are that when you practice spiritual disciplines, the goal here is that you are encountering God's grace. It's not just that you're doing religious activities. It's that you're encountering the presence of the living God. Now, traditionally, some of the ways that people have talked about spiritual disciplines for generations are in 2 big categories. And I find these categories really helpful to think about because as you're thinking about what are the disciplines that I need to have in my life to shape my life and to form my life, you want to be thinking about how do I have things from both of these categories present in my life. And so these 2 categories, again, this is old kind of language because this is very traditional. This is things that Christians have learned for generations and generations, that they've learned that these practices shape us. And so these 2 big categories are on one hand what we call works of piety, and then on the other category is works of mercy. Old kind of language, but really helpful for thinking about how this shapes us and what it is that we need to be having in our lives. Now, this first category, works of piety. You know, piety is an old word, and it's really about our devotion to God, our love that we have for God. And so, as we talk about works of piety, we're talking about what are the kinds of things that we should do that really help us grow in our love for God, our connection to God, help us grow in our devotion to God, these kinds of things. And so traditionally, Christians have looked at these works of piety and they've come up with some very specific things that we know that if you pay attention to these things, you cultivate these things in your life, you're going to tend to grow. And so here's some examples of this. You think about works of piety. We're talking about things like Bible reading and study of the Bible, memorization of the Bible, spending time with the Word is a work of piety. Daily prayer, praying for others, giving thanks is a work of piety. Worship, not just weekly church worship where you join together with your family of faith, but also daily worship as you maybe listen to worship music or give thanks to God, praise to God in different ways. Journaling, writing down and recording the way that God is at work in your life. Silence and solitude are some ways that people have practiced these works of piety. Intentional times that are for reflection and to better hear the voice of God. Fasting would be another work of piety where we intentionally withhold something from ourselves in order to focus on the Lord. And the list could go on and on and on and on. I mean, there's all kinds of ways that people have done this, but the point is we have to have ways, specific, intentional ways in our life that we are cultivating a way to grow in our love for God. Because if you don't have these intentional, specific practices, patterns, ways of being formed, disciplines in your life, then you're not going to grow in your love of God. And so we've recognized you got to have some very specific kinds of things, because you're not going to stumble into a deep relationship with God. It doesn't happen on accident. So you got to be thinking, what are the ways that I am specifically trying to grow in my love for God? That's works of piety. And then you have works of mercy. And Jesus talked about these two great commandments. You love God, you love your neighbor. The book of James talks about how can you love God who you've never seen if you can't love your neighbor who you do see? And so we know that we also love God, not just individually, but we love God by loving God's people and serving. And so these are works of looking out into the world to see how can I make a difference and how can I love God in this kind of way. And so, traditionally, we talk about this in a few ways. We think about serving the poor in practical kinds of ways. We have a food pantry at our church. That'd be a great example of very intentionally trying to serve people who are in need. We got things like sharing our faith, sharing the gospel, developing relationships with non-believers can be a work of mercy. We've got acts of hospitality, opening our home, which is an ancient Christian virtue of opening our home, opening our lives, hosting people, that especially those who are outside of the community of faith or those who have without, in order to build those kinds of relationships. Tithing, using our resources to further God's work, grow God's kingdom. Maybe intercessory prayer, where we're specifically praying for others, not just ourselves, but praying for others. Maybe serving others in the church, where we're using our spiritual gifts to serve others. Maybe going on mission trips, especially cross-cultural mission trips. And again, I'm just trying to give you an overview of what these look like. But the point is, how are you going to find specific, intentional ways that you cultivate a love for God by serving your neighbor? And that's the point of these two great categories and why I think they're so helpful. Because we need to be thinking about this in those two terms. Like, how am I specifically, intentionally cultivating a love for God? How am I specifically, intentionally, and purposely cultivating a love for my neighbor? And we have to have ways of doing this that we're paying attention to, because otherwise it's just not going to happen. We're going to be distracted. We're going to have things in the way. We're not going to grow in our love in these kinds of ways, and we're just going to become stuck. And so sometimes when I go over lists like this with people, they ask me, oh my gosh, Spencer, that's so much. So where do I start? I mean, I just gave you a ton of things that you could do, but where do I start? And that is a great question that we're going to handle in the next session.